How did Saturday Night Live ruin our consciousness? Well, today we are going to hear from the proclaimed and legendary author David Foster Wallace on the positive and negative aspects of Saturday Night Live. Because you and I, we know that Saturday Night Live sucks in 2024. But Wallace was born in 1962 and got to experience some of the golden eras and seasons of SNL, and also existed in a time where television was the supreme modality of information. Because, yeah, people like Pete Davidson and Shane Gillis maybe aren't the most funny people in the world, but they're having to work and exist. Even though Shane never really did SNL, but they have to exist in a politically correct environment where they are constrained not only comedically, but by the reach that SNL has in 2024. Because to watch it, you have to have a cable subscription. Like, I don't know any adults that are under 30, like friends of mine, that have cable. And the acquaintances I do know, they are just, put the blinders on, turn on sports game every single night type of people. And I have no idea if they're watching SNL. And an average of 4 million people watch an episode of SNL a week. And if you take a quick look at these charts of TV ratings, especially the one on the right, you can see from the 1970s and 80s the sharp decline of ratings. At least we are now existing at anywhere from a third to a half of the viewership that SNL was getting in the 70s and the 80s. And in a second, we're going to hear from Wallace. But if you guys don't already know, my name is Ian, and on this channel, we cover everything related to the greatest authors and books of all time. And one of those authors is, of course, David Foster Wallace. And I have a playlist down below that has over 60 videos on Wallace so far. And so if you want to hear content just like this and more from Wallace and do deep dives into some of his stories, books, and opinions on life, go check out some of those videos when you are done with this one. And let us now hear from Wallace.
See, this is the thing is, it's one of the reasons I'm nervous coming on radio shows talking about this stuff is, yeah, Dan Aykroyd parodied stuff, but I'll bet a lot of your listeners don't even remember. This stuff is fairly fresh to me because I was 18, 19, 20, when Saturday Night Live was at its zenith. And for your listeners who are younger than that, the 1-2 punch of Saturday Night Live and the David Letterman show did a number on I think the American psyche and the American sense of humor like maybe nothing else. And a lot of it consisted in making really ingenious fun of hypocrisies and kind of old-fashioned, quaint, the sort of commercial where the woman strokes her chin and says, oh, gosh, Bob never says that about my meatloaf and stuff like that. So and it was totally brilliant, and it was totally exhilarating for me to watch. But like the black humorists of the '60s, it I think introduced a kind of carapace of irony into the upscale term is cultural discourse. The ways you and I talk to each other and the way we talk to each other as a group, whether through art or in public discussions, that I just don't think the country's recovered from. And I may be wacko about this. I've never heard anybody else who thinks, who really thinks Saturday Night Live was a pivotal moment,
seminal moment.
And what's really interesting about Wallace's analysis here is that in 2016, when Donald Trump was elected, Saturday Night Live numbers soared during that next season. And if you guys don't remember, they were just taking shots and doing skits mocking Donald Trump and Mike Pence and what they were doing all the time. And this was a genius strategy because over 100 million people just in the United States alone hated Donald Trump. And obviously this was a gimmick that eventually ran its course. But what Donald Trump did for a lot of people and American politics and media in general is kind of bring in this new flavor of hypocrisy that most people had never seen in politics before, because all politicians are hypocrites, obviously, especially the ones at the highest level of any country. But we've gotten so used to the typical gag. Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton were all related to previous presidents, Obama and Bill Clinton and George Bush, his dad was a president. So we kind of got lulled into this. This is just how it is. There are these people and they don't really rock the boat. But then Trump comes out and he starts saying, they ask him, you've called women, fat and slobs and told men to grab their pussies. And he says, only Rosie O'Donnell. And he just WWD'd everybody. He just walked around all the questions with humor and all these other things. And then was on Twitter at 2 or 3 in the morning sometimes, tweeting stuff that was really funny or very insightful, and other stuff that was just straight up dumb or random. And so there was just an endless stream of content for critique. And obviously his personality and how he was conducting himself was aiding in that. And so why am I bringing up Donald Trump though? Well, if you go back and you look at the early seasons of Saturday Night Live and really comedy and the artistic world in general in the 70s and the 80s, that was the same thing, but they had everything to work with. Imagine being a writer or a comedian, and no one has ever really critiqued Christianity or Mormons or the DMV or certain types of music or people. Imagine being the first person to be able to make a joke about that or do a scathing critique of it. That isn't just an old person like they're ruining our society, but being a young person who's involved in it and being able to artistically play with it. And even more so, having the ability to analyze kind of this dinosaur society, these dinosaur institutions like marriage and all the branches of government and the military that have kind of been this long-standing tradition that we were never allowed to critique. Because obviously here in America, we had democracy for almost all of our history, but there were people like Joseph McCarthy accusing people of being communists. If you go back in history, have always, especially as, illiterate citizens, if we go back into the 1800s and the 1700s, never really had the ability to critique some of these higher up institutions. But kind of with this new safety net in the 70s and 80s, once we kind of were awakened, through the psychedelic movement and the anti-war movement, that ability existed. And it was a necessity. So we start doing it, right? We starting to tear down some of these institutions, and it feels good, right? You're like, oh my God, like, thank God. We finally have some room to breathe. I don't have to sit and marry, Johnny the abuser at my high school anymore, because that's just all there is, and that's all I'll ever know. And I can't even think of ways to critique Johnny other than that he's just mean. No one's ever really made fun of him before on television in an authentic way. And that started to happen. And when you look at people like David Letterman and other late night hosts, they started to, break humor and start to push back against some of these celebrities because, today we have this total access to celebrities. We have their Instagram and we can see where they live, see what their house looks like and all this stuff. Even if they're reclusive, we can still almost know everything about them. But if you go back to an earlier time in our history, before the internet and before late night talk show hosts started to probe, a little bit deeper, they were sort of these mystical icons that you maybe learned about in newspaper articles or something like that. But what if they didn't do them, or what if they didn't give away that much information? And in these articles, a lot of the time, they're being interviewed in the more classical sense, and they weren't getting, this major pushback because a lot of stuff was hidden. We now know that a lot of these artists were addicted to heroin or were very abusive to women or all these other things, or that like Led Zeppelin was putting sharks in underage girls' vaginas, like crazy stuff like that. But at the time, it really wasn't like, front cover news. If One Direction or whatever boy band is really popular right now, who knows? I've been out of that loop for about over a decade. But imagine they took one of their underage 14-year-old groupies into the back, and just for fun, just to laugh about it, just like having fun with the boys, they put a shark in in that girl's vagina. That would be the biggest scandal, maybe in media history. They'd be going to jail for 20 years, but Led Zeppelin did whatever. It's front page news now. If I think I saw like one of the Drake and Josh guys, like he was texting a 15-year-old girl or something. And he's, it's a huge front page deal, as it should be, because adult men should not be talking to 14 or 15-year-old women or girls. But there's a stark contrast in our relationship with celebrities and how much we know about them. And so Letterman had that ability to ask some of these questions, to confront these people face to face and joke at them, or like engage with them in ways that seemed odd to people who were idolizing these certain figures. And so this starts. But eventually, what happens when people start to watch it all the time? Well, they start to do that to the idols in their own life. Like, okay, let's critique Nixon. Let's critique the government. Let's critique Reagan. Like, okay, Jimmy Carter, like, cool. But what starts to happen when you start to critique the pivotal members of your community? The people who aren't perfect, but let's say aren't abusive, aren't like totally bad people who are trying very hard to be just and fair and good people and like keep the community together. Because that's what you're going to do when you start to see it on TV. You're going to start to see your teacher or the local police officer or your parents or whoever, your grandparents, as outdated and mockable because they have their own hypocrisies. All of our parents do. As you grow older, you kind of, ingrain some of these opinions and you're like, you know what? I'm doubling down on this. I do this all the time. I'm like, this may not be like the most logical personal development or philosophical decision, but I'm going with it no matter what. And it may contrast my whole worldview or something, but I'm like, okay, doesn't matter. Not everything needs to be perfect. But I could, there are sheaths in my armor now. There are these abilities for people to attack me. And when you get large enough, when you're a voice and a figure, obviously it's good for checks and balance. And if you have an abusive parent or something, but if you have a good group of people around you whose sole mission is to give and to sacrifice to help lift you up in life, raise you up in consciousness or make sure that you can have a successful life, and you start to make fun of them, then we start to have problems. And when you start to bully and jeer your friends too much, that kind of goes beyond the typical level of bullying, then things get crazy because, and I don't know if anyone out there is a fan of Mishima, the radical Japanese author, and I love him. I've read probably over 90% of his novels, and he has so many. That guy was a beast. Just a quick Mishima aside. This guy was releasing novels like at least a couple times, at least once a year, if not more. Like he has this massive catalog of books that are somewhat not even famous anyway. But in this one book, The Sailor Who Fell from Grace with the Sea, one of the main points is there's this group of boys and they've lost all morality. And at the end, and I'm spoiling here a little bit, they decide to do something very terrible to somebody. Or maybe they do, maybe they don't. I'm not going to say. But they're this terrible group of boys. And this is taking place in the early 60s, actually, when things are starting to make this turn. Because now we have this idea of psychological bullying, which, if you go back to an earlier time in history, people were getting psychologically bullied, but it wasn't really a thing yet. I remember when I entered the 6th grade. So I went 1st through 5th grade. I went to Joe Mackey Elementary School in Las Vegas, and it was in one of the more rough neighborhoods in town. And it was its population was 90% minorities. So 10% white, 90% of different races. And I had a great time there. Everyone was very nice to me. I remember maybe in 1st grade, there was a kid who had like problems with abuse from his dad who was a little bit mean to me, but that all got resolved and we eventually kind of became friends. Everything was really chill. But then in middle school, I went to a school because I originally went there because my sister, who's much older than me, went there and my mom knew everybody there and really liked them. So then I went there. But for middle school, so I actually didn't live very close to there anymore because we had moved away while my sister was going there. And so I went to my zoned middle school and it was 90% white. And I remember walking in on the first day of middle school, not knowing anybody. And everyone at the old school had been nice to me and I had been nice to them. I don't remember that many fights, that many problems, no bullying. Walking on the first day of 6th grade, and I'm immediately getting psychologically bullied. People are like, who wears shoes like that? Like, who wears this? Who wears that? Who's that? What's that haircut? People were just, and that, like, it got bad and eventually escalated into physical bullying and turned into this whole thing. But it was so intense and it came out of nowhere and it was like absolutely overwhelming and I had no idea what to do. And other kids obviously at the school were experiencing this and they were cutting themselves and this was back in 2003, 2004. And so as a teacher who's actively been teaching over the past 6 or 7 years, I will tell you this problem hasn't gotten solved. There are all these anti-bullying campaigns and report the bully and all this stuff. And all the kids now are awakened and have social media and they all understand this and are supposedly nice. And I will tell you firsthand that nothing has changed. That I'm sure there's some schools like the one I was at, because I'm sure if I went to middle school with those kids, everything would have been fine. And there would have been some problems that I would have kept moving forward. But kids now have this ultimate ability to critique and do these scathing rebukes of people. And where did they learn that? Because if they were doing that back in the day, because it's not just toward other students, it's toward me. I get criticized and talk shit to all the time. At least once a week, I get told, I'm not listening to you. You're an idiot. You have no idea what you're talking about because you only make this amount of money. You have no money because you're a teacher, so I'm not going to listen to you because if you're not making money, you're not worth anything. And that's like a light critique. That's just like a walk in the park. Like I just brush that off. I'm just like, all right, whatever. And luckily I deal with crazy YouTube comments every day. So I'm like, oh, okay, this is nothing. But I get crazy. And my wife, who is a teacher, and I have a lot of friends, obviously, who are teachers. And some of the stuff that gets said to people hurts them, hurts adults. And The kids think that's funny, but where did they learn that? Because back in the day, they would obviously get paddled. They get the shit beat out of them if they did that to anyone. And that's how the real world used to work, before the internet. Because before the internet, there was no way to communicate with someone. Maybe you could talk crap about someone in a newspaper or like do it through letters or behind the scenes. But if you were doing behind the scenes and that person figured out what you were doing, they had usually the right and would come and beat you up and nothing, or try and fight you and see what would happen. And nothing would happen to them because the police would get told them, they're like, yeah, this guy was talking crap about me. And the police would be like, why were you talking crap about him? Why were you saying all this? So there used to be this system of checks and balances that doesn't exist anymore. And there's also this aspect of being anonymous on the internet that didn't exist before. And so going back to SNL in the 70s and the 80s, this idea of irony and critique starts to build up. This idea that we can criticize the ones above us, even just in our communities, because that's important, starts to fester. And at the start, it starts to check some of the parents, check some of the teachers, get rid of some of the more blunt hypocrisy, some of the more rough edges. But it's a feeding frenzy, though, you guys. Like when you start bullying or when you start manipulating people or being crazy, it's an addiction because there's a rush. It feels good. And most of all, you're moving away from your own trauma. Because before, we resolved our trauma either by suffering in silence or resolving it, or, offing yourself. But people, are offering themselves at an extreme rate now, by committing suicide. And so now we have, this pharmacological society where a lot of people are on pills, and more kids each year are getting on Adderall and Ritalin and all these other drugs. And we have no idea what to do with all this trauma. And obviously our world is getting more complex and with technology and stuff. So there are these bigger potentialities that we have to deal with. And obviously the old suffer in silence, therapeutic, non-therapeutic approach doesn't really work anymore. And a lot of these other things, but we're starting to create these emotional monsters who are honestly very scary, because who you should be scared of. And look back into your past. Like, when you look back at like the kids you used to know or adults you've known, the people who are scary, like scare me. There's this guy named Tim who I used to know. And when I moved to Oregon to be a ski instructor, the first night I get there was a party going on. So I go to the party. I'm the new guy at this party. I'm hanging out and I'm happy to be there and I smile a lot. So I'm hanging out and I'm like getting a drink or something. And this guy walks up to me. He's like, who are you? I'm like, yeah, my name's Ian. I just moved here. I moved in with my friend Russ. You know Russ. Oh, cool. And I'm smiling, talking to him. Like, where are you from? Oh, you're from the East Coast. That's awesome. That's crazy. The skiing over there isn't good, I'm sure. And then he looks at me and he pushes me. He says, I don't fucking like you. Why are you smiling so much? You one of those rich kids? You look like one of those rich kids I used to go to school with on the East Coast. I'm like, bro, I'm from Las Vegas. I went to Joe Mackey Elementary. I didn't say that. I was like, no, bro, we're cool. Like, I'm literally going to start working with you tomorrow. You're a snowboard instructor. I'm going to be a ski instructor. Like, we're cool. And I didn't insult him. I didn't do anything. I didn't laugh at him. I was just smiling like, yeah, man, it's awesome. I just was feeling good. And this guy says, no, you're disrespecting me. I want to fight you. I don't like guys like you. And he swings on me. This guy, this situation, for me talking to him swinging on me was less than a minute. And from him getting mad at me to him swinging on me was less than 10 seconds. And luckily it wasn't my first, rodeo, and I had done, wrestling and stuff. And so I hit a takedown and then I like get away. I'm like, I'm telling my friends, I'm like, guys, like, what is happening? Get this guy off of me. And they break it up. But that guy was unhinged. Like, knowing him later, and like he's now dead from committing suicide, shot himself with a shotgun. That guy was random. Sometimes he'd be your best friend. Other times he'd want to fight you. And it's because he wasn't in tune with his emotions. He didn't understand and couldn't control himself. And because that requires effort to be able. You have to be trained and have to, by others or by yourself, to be able to control your emotions. But what happens to a society and what happens to a group of people who displace all those emotions? Because I see kids now, and what are they doing with those emotions? Well, if maybe they're on pills, maybe they're numbing themselves with TikTok, or they're taking pills. And so all this emotion is displaced and they never have to learn these lessons. But sometimes that rises up. Sometimes that comes out of nowhere. And these irrational decisions that are much more irrational than teenage decisions, because teenagers and young adults and even adults make bad decisions. Sometimes we act irrationally. But there are levels. Like sometimes, people act very irrationally, randomly, for no reason. And it's extreme in its irrationality. And I've been seeing more and more of that because with the tablet kid generation and the pharmaceutical nation we are living in now, everyone's displacing their emotions. And so if something goes wrong or there are these kind of triggers or these things that pull them out, and they have to actually use their emotional training to deal with the situation. They can't do it, and then anything can happen. So when we have this world of sleepers that can be awakened at any second, and the only thing they have in their brain, because they weren't shown love, obviously a lot of kids aren't shown love. A lot of people don't know how to love themselves or love another in a real way, because love isn't, I'm going to protect you, I'm going to give you the best life. Like, love is actually an action. It's real. You do something. You guys understand. So most people in the world have never experienced love. And where we found love back in the day, like, where did you find love? I first didn't find the concept of love through women, especially as a young man. I first found it through animals. Through my pets, like being able to take care of them every day and realize, like, wow, this dog has to sit here all day while I'm at school. So I'm going to make sure to walk it a couple miles at night, and playing with my dogs. And I'm getting to know the personality, and like really like feeling sad when I had to go on a trip. Like when I had to go to Boy Scout camp or something for 10 days over the summer, I'd be like, not sad because I couldn't use my phone or play video games or see people or do whatever. I'd be like, damn, like, I'm not going to see my dogs. And like, I know my parents are going to walk them 3 miles at night. So like, they're going to be sad, and I'd get sad. And so I started to understand that reciprocal relationship. And then that kind of led into like my friends, like with my friends, I'd be like, wow, some of these were female friends. Like, I want you guys to, do well in life. I want you guys to be happy. I want us to have experiences together. And like, I'd think about them and what they were going through. And I started to develop that reciprocal relationship with them. And I'd grow with them and learn with them and all these other things. And then eventually, that translated into normal relationships, which obviously is where love is like experienced at the highest level, other than maybe self-love. And I love you, and I love you so much that I compiled 400 of David Foster Wallace's favorite books. And all you have to do is to access this free PDF is go to the description below, click on the link, enter your email, and it will be sent to your email immediately. And so if you don't already have a copy, it's been recently updated, and I'd love for you to grow your to-read list. Anyway, the only thing in their brain, because love really isn't in there, because I have so many kids whose parents give away their dogs and their cats when they're like 7 or 8 years old because they just don't want to take care of them anymore. They just go give them to a shelter. And when I hear that, nothing makes me more furious, but don't get me into that. So that's not a thing. And kids have less friends than ever now. So friendship and that type of stuff isn't a thing. And when they do hang out, it's on TikTok or these things. So the only thing in their brain is critique, is resentment, because that's what the algorithm pushes. It pushes polarity. It pushes these people who have branded so well that they have to have an enemy, because that's the number one thing a brand has to have. Well, who are we against? What are we pushing against? And so this us versus them mentality, this base consciousness mentality is always in their head, and it's always this power dynamic. Who's taller, who's shorter, who's better looking. And that's what a reaction video is, which is crazy, even though this is technically a reaction video. But like these quick, reaction videos are mostly critiques, or like giving precedence or superiority to the reaction and the reactor rather than the original source itself. And if you're not adding, like hopefully right now I'm adding to what David Foster Wallace just said. I know I am. But if you're just like, if I listen to that clip and I was like, yeah, screw us, and I was doing that, I'm not adding anything. And that's what most reactions are. And so everyone's sleeping, and then when you turn the power button on, pi and phi, when we finally decide to hit the pi button, or is it phi? Who knows? Technically, both. The power system is both phi and pi. But when that happens, they like awaken into the world, And the only pre-built setting they have is critique, react, or just obey. There's that too. And that's a scary thing. And so it all stems from this original attack, because we've slowly weeded the people out who could help us, who could raise us in consciousness and talk about emotion, like being emotional. Because in schools now, you're not allowed to obviously spiritually educate people, or really emotionally educate people, or even physically and mentally educate people. Like, what is physical education class in high school? Like, they run around and play dodgeball. But what physical education is supposed to be is learning the actual important aspects of physicality, which I would say the highest of that is martial arts, because you're learning the spiritual aspect of moving with another human being. Martial arts at the best level is a dance with another human being. And yes, you're engaging in combat, but it's a beautiful thing that is spiritual if looked at in the right way. There's obviously dance, which is connecting with another person. You know, how would men and women's relationships, especially at young ages, be different if all of them had to dance with each other all the time? Or doing yoga, understanding subtle body awareness, and then obviously strength training, like understanding your own strength. And as someone who has substituted many physical education class and weight room classes, I walk in there and I see kids doing shoulder presses like this in their body, and the worst form ever. And it's hard. You know, you have 32 people and kids all going through puberty and growing, and you're trying to control them all at once. Like, I understand it's hard, and it's not the teacher's fault necessarily, because when you look at how you're supposed to be trained in like Olympic lifting or weightlifting, you use like a stick for a long time and you like totally focus on technique. Anyway, so physical education is out. Emotional education, you can't talk about that, because emotional education immediately, like within 1% of that, immediately turns back onto the parents. As soon as you start talking about that, people start talking about abuse, and then suddenly you're like inciting riots and inciting people to critique their parents and realize maybe things aren't as good as they seem, or critique the environment they are in, which, you know, you can't do that. Then we have mental education, which is somewhat restricted because you have to teach to the weakest person in the room, or the weakest group in the room most of the time. And then obviously spiritual education is not allowed anymore, because religious people are so scared that if you mention any other thing that their child may wake up and be like, man, this may not be true. And so the teachers and then the community members who could help, you know, maybe work on one of those different aspects, because one could be enough. If you got really into martial arts, and especially like the spiritual side, then a lot of the other aspects would be taken care of. You learn emotional control. You start to educate yourself and realize that mental education is just the other side of physical education, and you learn in the same way just through practice. And then, yeah, suddenly you gain all this knowledge just through focusing on one thing. Same could be said about mental education. You read about emotional intelligence and start applying it. You read about workout plans and why working out is important. And then you read about God and stuff and start to connect with God in that way. So it's sad and crazy to think that a lot of this all started back with SNL and David Letterman. So what are your guys' thoughts? How do you guys see, and we talk about this a lot, but hopefully I took this in a different direction today and talked more about these axiomatic desires and about how it affected the community, and not just, you know, how celebrities were taken out in some of these big institutions, but rather, you know, integral community members and familiar members, especially like the elderly and the grandparents, like the people with the actual wisdom and with holding actual lineages of knowledge are now just disappearing. Like my grandpa was a Freemason, and then his great grandpa, and my dad and I'm not a Freemason. My dad isn't a Freemason, but my grandpa was a Freemason, and there had been multiple generations, like I think 3 or 4, like going back into the early 1800s of Freemasons in the Cadenac line. And so I researched Freemasonry, heavily, and did all this research. And then I went and talked to him about it. And he was like 90 something years old. And was the only time we really, really connected, because we went deep. I talked about all this stuff, and he got sentimental thinking about his dad, because he really wasn't that into it. His dad was really into it, and like his great grandpa, like they were really into it. And so he got into it because they were into it, but he didn't push that onto my dad. And he eventually kind of like fizzled out with that in his like 40s and stuff. But he basically told me, you know, you don't need to join the group, but just understanding this knowledge will make, you know, almost guarantee you your success in life. And so by having that respect and hearing about the things he was into and researching it and talking to him about it at length and at times over a period of time, because at times he'd get tired and not want to talk about it anymore. Okay, whatever. Get cranky. That's cool. You're 93 years old. And so that's what I'm trying to do with this channel, even though it's fun and it's jokes and I shit on people sometimes and we have fun with like Windy Goon and stuff. Like I am trying to show some seriousness. I am trying to hopefully create a mentality that respects my elders and respects hopefully where we are going and respects myself and where you guys are going. So thank you guys for being here, and I will see you in the next video.